It's now August 14th, 8 days into Ukraine's surprise cross-border incursion into Russian territory in Kursk Oblast. Things have been moving very fast on the ground, and we've been doing our best here at the Kyiv Independent to keep everyone up to date. But now that we can take a step back and look at some initial results, we're really excited today to speak to Mick Ryan, a retired Australian Major General who has constantly written from a very interesting perspective of his about the war in Ukraine, and as well on his Substack about the offensive into Kursk. How did you react when it first started? What did you think was initially happening?
Well, initially I thought, well, first reports are always wrong. In the army, the first reports are just never accurate for a variety of reasons. And I think that was probably the case here, is, we just weren't sure how big this Ukrainian operation was. Was it a raid? Was it something more substantial? But it became pretty clear pretty quick once different brigades and elements of brigades unveiled themselves that this was more than just a raid. This was a fairly substantial Ukrainian ground force operation.
One thing that definitely, it seemed like they did very well was this operational security, this aspect of surprise. Were you surprised that they managed that at this point in the war?
Not really. I've never really bought into this concept of the transparent battlefield. I mean, wars are human; they're not technological. And it's humans who make all the key decisions. It's humans who surprise other humans. And whilst we might have better visibility of what we've seen compared to previous wars, you can't see into the hearts and minds of human beings. And at the end of the day, clever humans will always find ways to fool and to deceive other humans. That's what Ukraine has done here. They have clearly devised and executed a very clever deception plan over the last few months, if not further back, to deceive the Russians about a few key things. Firstly, Ukraine's capacity to undertake offensive operations. Secondly, where they might undertake an offensive, the geography. Third, the timing. I mean, I don't think anyone really expected Ukraine to conduct large-scale offensives this year, maybe local counterattacks, so they've deceived the Russians about that. And they're probably still deceiving the Russians about what their strategic objectives are for this operation. There's lots of speculation about that, and we all think one of the objectives is to draw away Russian forces from their main effort in the Donbass, but there's probably a fair few other objectives that they seek as well.
Sometimes these border raids in the previous year have come under a fair bit of criticism for just being only political and not having this immediate military result, potentially.
Well, it's certainly a big swing. I mean, this is a very risky operation. It's high risk, but potentially high return. The risk, clearly, is losing more terrain, including some pretty key towns in Donbass and major logistics locations, as well as more Ukrainian ground forces, every single one of which is precious. But the big return might well be that, one, they slow down or stop that Russian offensive, and two, really force the Russians to rethink their overall campaign, to move their forces and create other opportunities for Ukrainian ground forces to attack Russian forces, to destroy them, to liberate Ukrainian territory, but also to reinvigorate support for Ukraine in Europe and the United States, and say to its supporters, one, we're still capable of advancing; two, we're still willing to fight; three, we just need your help, a bit more of it, to finish off the Russians. We need to beat them, not be stuck in this endless defend Ukraine kind of strategy.
It feels like what you're getting at is there's some kind of real intangible value to showing that you can take the initiative again, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think what Ukraine has done is change the status quo of the war. I mean, everyone's been talking about stalemate, even though it hasn't quite been a stalemate. Well, it is definitely not that now. It is a war of movement. henceforth the Russians will have to invest far more in defending their borders, which they haven't really done. You're there, you hopefully see a bounce in morale among the Ukrainian people, but I can tell you soldiers, when they're on the offensive like this, their morale is infinitely better. They feel like they're achieving something. There was this great quote from a young Ukrainian soldier in The Economist where he said, "I felt like a tiger again." It's like, that's amazing. That's what you want them to feel.
I'm curious, you were talking about the war of movement, and you wrote about this in your most recent piece, about how can we explain, like, how does this transition look now that we're talking about the big question of whether Ukraine will dig in? Obviously, along the front line, we've had hundreds of kilometers of very, positional trench warfare, one tree line at a time, one trench at a time, very clear front line. But then in the initial days, especially of the Kursk offensive, it was pure frantic maneuver all over the place. How does that transition look from maneuver to back to positional when we're talking about digging in? And where do you think we are at this point now?
Well, most military operations have a pretty set template in their phases. I mean, there's obviously the preparation phase, which is everything from deception to concentrating troops. There's a break-in and breakthrough phase where clearly through that, the Ukrainian forces have broken through the two lines of Russian defences. They were in what we'd call now an exploitation phase, where they're kind of running riot until the Russians can stop them from doing that. Russian resistance will naturally increase, and Ukrainian friction will increase just because of logistics, because people are tired, because of the distance that supply lines are stretched and those kind of things. There will be a natural point where the Ukrainian offensive will culminate. It won't be capable of sustaining the attack any longer. When that is, it's one of those things you just don't know. It could be days, could be weeks. But when they do, they'll have to consolidate. And I think, as I wrote in that piece, there's three real options. Do they stand fast where they are at the end of that exploitation field? That's a fairly big bit of ground and a fairly long line to defend. Do they withdraw back into more defensible terrain that might actually kind of straighten the line that the Ukrainians have to defend instead of just the frontier? Or do they withdraw entirely, which would also be a sensible thing if you want to preserve all your forces that were involved and then use them for other opportunities to go back into Russia and other locations. So, I'm sure the General Staff is planning hourly on which one of those options it might wish to choose.
What do you think is the possibility there to really defend in a way that there is perspective to hold this for a longer time? And if they do, is the aim there to, I guess, force Russia to really commit a lot of forces to push them out rather than hopefully just wait for them to go across the border themselves again?
Well, any retention of Russian territory will be a major effort from the Ukrainian ground forces. Not just frontline troops, but air defence, electronic warfare, medical evacuation, logistics, communications. All these things will be taxed to the limit to sustain that salient. And it's a long way from other places where the Russians are attacking. So, it's a lot of resources to do that. Certainly, if Ukraine did decide to do that, they would have no choice but to dig in, because that's the best way to hold ground and impose a really significant cost on the enemy, the Russians, if they want to take it back. But of course, you do go the risk. You have the risk of losing that force that you have in Russia. And my sense is, Ukraine can't afford to be losing entire brigades. It can't when things are good. It definitely can't when things are tough like it is in the Donbass at the moment. So, which way the president and his advisors are going to go is really hard to tell. But like you mentioned before, there are political, there are strategic, there are military considerations in this. And there are just so many different combinations that could be involved in the decision on what this force actually does eventually.
I was curious about how you see the Russian reaction. First of all, like what does it look like? What do you think the generals thought when they saw this kind of happening, starting out?
Well, I'm sure the very first thing they did was offer a few choice expletives, because they would have been surprised very unpleasantly. That's a good thing for Ukraine. But then they'll be looking at what are our contingency plans. And from what I've seen, they probably didn't have too many contingency plans. I think Dara Masakot's recent thread on this is instructive, because they were still going through a command and control change for Russian forces in that area. So there'll be a fair bit of confusion in the command and control in that area. And then they'll be looking at what are our reserves and where are they? How quickly can we get there? And who will they work for? I mean, these will be the big questions. And then there'll be a whole lot of subordinate questions like support, munitions. Are there vulnerable targets that the Ukrainians might be getting at, both military and civil, including the Kursk nuclear power plant? So all these kind of considerations will be what they would have looked at in that first 24 hours. As they fought through the shock of surprise and came up with plans for responding. And there would have been an initial plan for response, and then they would have fleshed out that with subsequent plans as more forces become available, as additional aircraft and sorties become available. And that plan will constantly evolve based on where and when Ukraine attacks part of this operation.
Thank you. Just to really finish off, I'm curious, what do you see in this operation about lessons for the way that kind of state-on-state war can look like? I think we all got very used to the idea of this trenches and drones kind of war that we saw, but maybe this opened the door and showed that something else was possible. And there's this, you have FPV drones knocking out helicopters or at least damaging them, but then you see how important it is. You see how difficult it can be to see everything on the battlefield, and how well-planned maneuver armored operations can still be effective. Do you think this shows that this kind of war is not dead yet?
No, absolutely. It was never dead. It just took a rest every now and then in a couple of places in Ukraine. I mean, there's a lot of lessons, and I guess we'll wait and see what the ultimate outcome of this operation is to have a full assessment. But a few occur to me, that one, surprise is still possible. People still discount this in the 21st century, and it's like, of course it's still possible. Secondly, I think this shows the value of well-led, experienced combat formations in these kind of operations. We saw last year very green combat formations being used in the counteroffensive, and it didn't go well. So I think that's another lesson. And I think there are lessons around air defence, electronic warfare, deception, and these kind of things. But I think the most important lesson is war is still human. It's not a technological affair, even though we use a lot of technologies. It's humans. It's about humans planning. It's about humans deceiving. It's about humans leading. And it's about humans ultimately fighting as teams on behalf of their country, behalf of their brigade, behalf of their company, behalf of their platoon. So many of these are not new lessons. We just need to have them reinforced every now and then.
Here at the Kyiv Independent, we're doing everything we can to keep you all updated from the ground here in Ukraine, but also by speaking to some of the world's top minds on war and on this war in particular, like Mick today. To stay up to date with the Kursk offensive and everything else going on here in Ukraine, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you want to support our work, become a member of the Kyiv Independent on our website. Thank you.